Chapter 9. The air around the second planet of the Frog Star system was stale and unwholesome. The dank winds that swept continually over its surface swept over salt flats, dried up marshland, tangled and rotting vegetation, and the crumbling remains of ruined cities. No life moved across its surface. The ground, like that of many places in this part of the galaxy, had long been deserted. The howl of the wind was desolate enough as it gusted through the cold, decaying houses of the cities. It was more desolate as it whipped about the bottoms of the tall black towers that swayed uneasily here and there about the surface of this world. At the top of these towers lived colonies of large, scraggy, evil-smelling birds, the sole survivors of the civilization that once lived here. The howl of the wind was at its most desolate, however, when it passed over a pimple of a place set in the middle of a wide gray plain on the outskirts of the largest of the abandoned cities. This pimple of a place was the thing that had earned this world the reputation of being the most totally evil place in the galaxy. From, from without it was simply a steel dome about 30 feet across. From within it was something more monstrous than the mind can comprehend. About 100 yards or so away, and separated from it by a pockmarked and blasted stretch of the most barren land imaginable, was what would probably have been described as a landing pad of sorts. That is to say, that scattered over a largish area were the ungainly hulks of 2 or 3 dozen crash-landed buildings. Flitting over and around these buildings was a mind that was waiting for something. The mind directed its attention into the air, and before very long, a distant speck appeared, surrounded by a ring of smaller specks. The larger speck was the left-hand tower of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy office building, descending through the stratosphere of Frogstar World B. As it descended, Rusta suddenly broke the long, uncomfortable silence that had grown up between the two men. He stood up and gathered his towel into a bag. He said, "Beeblebrox, I will now do the job I was sent here to do." Zaphod looked up at him from where he was sitting in a corner, sharing unspoken thoughts with Marvin. "Yeah?" he said. "The building will shortly be landing. When you leave the building, do not go out of the door," said Rusta. "Go out the window." "Good luck," he added, and walked out of the door, disappearing from Zaphod's life as mysteriously as he had entered it. Zaphod leaped up and tried the door, but Rusta had already locked it. He shrugged and returned to the corner. 2 minutes later, the building crash-landed amongst the other wreckage. Its escort of Frogstar fighters deactivated their force beams and soared off into the air again, bound for Frogstar World A, an altogether most congenial spot. They never landed on Frogstar World B. No one did. No one ever walked on its surface other than the intended victims of the total perspective vortex. Zaphod was badly shaken by the crash. He lay for a while in the silent, dusty rubble to which most of the room had been reduced. He felt that he was at the lowest ebb he had ever reached in his life. He felt bewildered. He felt lonely. He felt unloved. Eventually, he felt he ought to get whatever it was over with. He looked around the cracked and broken room. The wall had split round the doorframe, and the door hung open. The window, by some miracle, was closed and unbroken. For a while he hesitated. Then he thought if his strange and recent companion had been through all that he had been through just to tell him what he had told him, then there must be a good reason for it. With Marvin's help, he got the window open. Outside it, the cloud of dust aroused by the crash and the hulks of the other buildings with which this one was surrounded effectively prevented Zaphod from seeing anything of the world outside. Not that this concerned him unduly. His main concern was what he saw when he looked down. Zarniwoop's office was on the 15th floor. The building had landed at a tilt of about 45 degrees, but still the descent looked heart-stopping. Eventually stung by the continuous series of contemptuous looks that Marvin appeared to be giving him, he took a deep breath and clambered out onto the steeply inclined side of the building. Marvin followed him, and together they began to crawl slowly and painfully down the 15 floors that separated them from the ground. As he crawled, the dank air and dust choked his lungs. His eyes smarted, and the terrific distance down made his head spin. The occasional remark from Marvin, of the order of, "This is the sort of thing you life forms enjoy, is it?" I ask merely for information, did little to improve his state of mind. About halfway down the side of the shattered building, they stopped to rest. It seemed to Zaphod as he lay there panting with fear and exhaustion, that Marvin seemed a mite more cheerful than usual. Eventually, he realized it wasn't so. The robot just seemed cheerful in comparison with his own mood. A large, scraggy black bird came flapping through the slowly settling clouds of dust, and stretching down its scrawny legs, landed on an inclined window ledge a couple of yards from Zaphod. It folded its ungainly wings and teetered awkwardly on its perch. Its wingspan, its wingspan must have been something like 6 feet, and its head and neck seemed curiously large for a bird. Its face was flat, the beak underdeveloped, and halfway along the underside of its wings, the vestiges of something hand-like could be clearly seen. In fact, it looked almost human. It turned its heavy eyes on Zaphod and clicked its beak in a desultory fashion. "Go away," said Zaphod. "Okay," muttered the bird morosely and flapped off into the dust again. Zaphod watched its departure in bewilderment. "Did that bird just talk to me?" he asked Marvin nervously. He was quite prepared to believe the alternate explanation, that he was in fact hallucinating. "Yes," confirmed Marvin. "Poor souls, poor souls," said a deep, ethereal voice in Zaphod's ear. Twisting around violently to find the source of the voice nearly caused Zaphod to fall off the building. He grabbed savagely at a protruding window fitting and cut his hand on it. He hung on, breathing heavily. The voice had no visible source whatsoever. There was no one there. Nevertheless, it spoke again. "A tragic history behind them, you know, a terrible blight." Zaphod looked wildly about. The voice was deep and quiet. In other circumstances, it would even be described as soothing. There is, however, nothing soothing about being addressed by a disembodied voice out of nowhere, particularly when you are, like Zaphod Beeblebrox, not at your best and hanging from a ledge 8 stories from a crashed building. "Hey, he stammered. "Shall I tell you their story?" inquired the voice quietly. "Hey, who are you?" panted Zaphod. "Where are you?" "Later on, perhaps," murmured the voice. "I am Gargravar. I am the custodian of the total perspective vortex." "Why can't I see—" "You will find your progress down the building gently facilitated," the voice lifted, "if you move about 2 yards to your left. Why don't you try it?" Zaphod looked and saw a series of short horizontal grooves leading all the way down the side of the building. Gratefully, he shifted himself across to them. "Why don't I see you again at the bottom?" said the voice in his ear, and as it spoke, it faded. "Hey," called out Zaphod, "where are you?" "It'll only take you a couple of minutes," said the voice, very faintly. "Marvin," said Zaphod earnestly to the robot, squatting dejectedly next to him. Did a voice just—" "Yes," replied Marvin, tersely. Zaphod nodded. He took out his peril-sensitive sunglasses again. They were completely black, and by now quite badly scratched by the unexpected metal objects in his pocket. He put them on. He would find his way down the building more comfortably if he didn't actually have to look at what he was doing. Minutes later, he clambered over the ripped and mangled foundations of the building. Once more removing his sunglasses, he dropped to the ground. Marvin joined him a moment or so later and lay face down in the dust and rubble, from which position he seemed disinclined to move. "Ah, there you are," said the voice suddenly in Zaphod's ear. "Excuse me leaving you like that. It's just that I have a terrible head for heights. At least," it added wistfully, "I did have a terrible head for heights." Zaphod looked around slowly and carefully, just to see if he had missed something which might be the source of the voice. All he saw, however, was the dust, the rubble, and the towering hulks of the encircling buildings. "Hey, why can't I see you?" he said. "Why aren't you here?" "I am here," the voice said slowly. "My body wanted to come, but it's a bit busy at the moment. Things to do, people to see." After what seemed like a sort of ethereal sigh, it added, "You know how it is with bodies." Zaphod wasn't sure about this. "I thought I did," he said. "I only hope it's gone for a rest cure," continued the voice. "The way it's been living recently, it must be on its last elbows." "Elbows?" said Zaphod. "Don't you mean last legs?" The voice said nothing for a while. Zaphod looked around uneasily. He didn't know if it had gone or was still there or what it was doing. Then the voice spoke again. "So, you are to be put into the vortex, yes?" Well," said Zaphod with a very poor attempt at nonchalance. "This cat's in no hurry, you know. I can just slouch about and take in a look at the local scenery, you know." Have you seen the local scenery? Asked the voice of Gargavar. No. Zaphod clambered over the rubble and rounded the corner of one of the wrecked buildings that was obscuring his view. He looked out at the landscape of Frogstar World B. Ah, okay, he said. I'll just sort of slouch about then. No, said Gargavar, the vortex is ready for you now. You must come. Follow me. Yeah, said Zaphod. And how am I meant to do that? I'll hum for you, said Gargavar. Follow the humming. A soft keening sound drifted through the air, a pale, sad sound that seemed to be without any kind of focus. It was only by listening very carefully that Zaphod was able to detect the direction from which it was coming. Slowly, dazedly, he stumbled off in its wake. What else was there to do? Chapter 10. The universe, as has been observed before, is an unsettlingly big place, a fact which for the sake of a quiet life most people tend to ignore. Many would happily move to somewhere rather smaller of their own devising, and this is what most beings in fact do. For instance, in one corner of the eastern galactic arm lies the large forest planet Aglarun, the entire intelligent population of which lives permanently in one fairly small and crowded nut tree, in which tree they are born, live, fall in love, carve tiny speculative articles in the bark on the meaning of life and the futility of death and the importance of birth control, fight a few extremely minor wars, and eventually die strapped to the underside of some of the less accessible outer branches. In fact, the only Aglarunians who ever leave their tree are those who are hurled out of it for the heinous crime of wondering whether any of the other trees might be capable of supporting life at all, or indeed whether the other trees are anything other than illusions brought on by eating too many ogla nuts. Exotic though this behavior may seem, there is no life form in the galaxy which is not in some way guilty of the same thing, which is why the total perspective vortex is as horrific as it is. For when you are put into the vortex, you are given just one momentary glimpse of the entire unimaginable infinity of creation, and somewhere in it a tiny little marker, a microscopic dot on a microscopic dot which says, "You are here." The gray plain stretched before Zaphod, a ruined, shattered plain. The wind whipped wildly over it. Visible in the middle was the steel pimple of the dome. This, gathered Zaphod, was where he was going. This was the total perspective vortex. As he stood and gazed bleakly at it, a sudden inhumane wail of terror emanated from it as of a man having his soul burned from his body. It screamed above the wind and died away. Zaphod started with fear, and his blood seemed to turn to liquid helium. Hey, what was that? He muttered voicelessly. A recording, said Gargavar, of the last man who was put in the vortex. It is always played for the next victim, a sort of prelude. Hey, it really sounds bad, stammered Zaphod. Couldn't we maybe slop off to a party or something for a while, think it over? For all I know, said Gargavar's ethereal voice, I'm probably at one. My body, that is. It goes to a lot of parties without me. Says I only get in the way. Hey-oh. What is all this about with your body? Said Zaphod, anxious to delay what it was that was going to happen to him. Well, it's busy, you know, said Gargavar hesitantly. You mean it's got a mind of its own? Said Zaphod. There was a long and slightly chill pause before Gargavar spoke again. I have to say, he replied eventually, that I find that remark in rather poor taste. Zaphod muttered a bewildered and embarrassed apology. No matter, said Gargavar, you weren't to know. The voice fluttered unhappily. The truth is, it continued in tones which suggested he was trying very hard to keep it under control. The truth is that we are currently undergoing a period of legal trial separation. I suspect it will end in divorce. The voice was still again, leaving Zaphod with no idea of what to say. He mumbled uncertainly. I think we were probably not very well suited, said Gargavar again at length. We never seemed to be happy doing the same things. We always had the greatest arguments over sex and fishing. Eventually, we tried to combine the two, but that only led to disaster, as you can probably imagine. And now my body refuses to let me in. It won't even see me. He paused again tragically. The wind whipped across the plain. It says I only inhibit it. I pointed out that, in fact, I was meant to inhabit it, and it said that that was exactly the sort of smart aleck remark that got right up a body's left nostril, and so we left it. It will probably get custody of my forename. Oh, said Zaphod faintly, and what's that? Pizpot, said the voice. My name is Pizpot Gargravar. Says it all, really, doesn't it? Said Zaphod sympathetically. And that is why I, as a disembodied mind, have this job, custodian of the total perspective vortex. No one will ever walk on the ground of this planet, except the victims of the vortex, and they don't really count, I'm afraid. I'll tell you the story. Would you like to hear it? Many years ago, this was a thriving, happy planet. People, cities, shops, a normal world, except that on the high streets of these cities, there were slightly more shoe shops than one might have thought necessary, and slowly, insidiously, the number of these shoe shops were increasing. It's a well-known economic phenomenon, but tragic to see it in operation. For the more shoe shops there were, the more shoes they had to make, and the worse and more unwearable they became. And the worse they were to wear, the more people had to buy to keep themselves shod, and the more the shops proliferated until the whole economy of the place passed what I believe is termed the shoe event horizon. And it became no longer economically possible to build anything other than shoe shops. Result, collapse, ruin, and famine. Most of the population died out. Those few who had the right kind of genetic instability mutated into birds. You've seen one of them, who cursed their feet, cursed the ground, and vowed that none should walk on it again. Unhappy lot. Come, I must take you to the vortex. Zaphod shook his head in bemusement and stumbled forward across the plain. And you, he said, you come from this hellhole pit, do you? No, no, said Gargavar, taken aback. I come from the Frog Star World Sea. Beautiful place, wonderful fishing. I flip back there in the evenings, though all I can do now is watch. The total perspective vortex is the only thing on this planet with any function. It was built here because no one else wanted it on their doorstep. At that moment, another dismal scream rent the air, and Zaphod shuddered. What can do that to a guy? He breathed. The universe, said Gargravar simply. The whole infinite universe, the infinite suns, the infinite distances between them, and yourself, an invisible dot on an invisible dot, infinitely small. Hey, I'm Zaphod Beeblebrock's man, you know, muttered Zaphod, trying to keep the last remnants of his ego. Gargravar made no reply, but merely resumed his mournful humming, till they reached the tarnished steel dome in the middle of the plain. As they reached it, a door hummed open in the side, revealing a small darkened chamber within. Enter, said Gargavar. Zaphod started with fear. Hey, what now? He said. Oh, hey, what now? He said. Now. Zaphod peered nervously inside. The chamber was very small. It was steel-lined, and there was hardly space in it for more than one man. It doesn't look like any kind of vortex to me, said Zaphod. It isn't, said Gargavar. It's just the elevator. Enter. With infinite trepidation, Zaphod stepped into it. He was aware of Gargavar being in the elevator with him, though the disembodied man was not for the moment speaking. The elevator began its descent. I must get myself into the right frame of mind for this, muttered Zaphod. There is no right frame of mind, said Gargavar sternly. You really know how to make a guy feel inadequate. I don't. The vortex does. At the bottom of the shaft, the rear of the elevator opened up, and Zaphod stumbled out into a smallish, functional, steel-lined chamber. At the far side of it stood a single upright steel box, just large enough for a man to stand in. It was that simple. It connected to a small pile of components and instruments via a single thick wire. Is that it? Said Zaphod in surprise. That is it. Didn't look too bad, thought Zaphod. And I get in there, do I? Said Zaphod. You get in there, said Gargavar, and I'm afraid you must do it now. Okay, said Zaphod. He opened the door of the box and stepped in. Inside the box, he waited. After 5 seconds, there was a click, and the entire universe was there in the box with him. Chapter 11. The total perspective vortex derives its picture of the whole universe on the principle of extrapolated matter analysis. To explain, since every piece of matter in the universe is some way affected by every other piece of matter in the universe, it is in theory possible to extrapolate the whole of creation, every sun, every planet, their orbits, their composition, and their economic and social history from, say, one small piece of fairy cake. The man who invented the total perspective vortex did so basically in order to annoy his wife. Trin Tragula, for that was his name, was a dreamer, a thinker, a speculative philosopher, or, as his wife would have it, an idiot. And she would nag him incessantly about the utterly inordinate amount of time he spent staring out into space, or mulling over the mechanics of safety pins, or doing spectrographic analysis of pieces of fairy cake. Have some sense of proportion, she would say, sometimes as often as 38 times in a single day. And so he built the total perspective vortex, just to show her. And in the end, he plugged the whole of reality as extrapolated from a piece of fairy cake, and into the other end he plugged his wife, so that when he turned it on, she saw in one instant the whole infinity of creation and herself in relation to it. To Trin Tragula's horror, the shock completely annihilated her brain, but to his satisfaction he realized that he had proved conclusively that if life is going to exist in a universe of this size, then one thing it cannot afford is to have a sense of proportion. The door of the vortex swung open. From his disembodied mind, Gargavar watched dejectedly. He had rather liked Zaphod Beeblebrox in a strange sort of way. He was clearly a man of many qualities, even if they were mostly bad ones. He waited for him to flop forward out of the box, as they all did. Instead, he stepped out. "Hi," he said. "Beeblebrox?" gasped Gargavar's mind in amazement. "Could I have a drink, please?" said Zaphod. You have been in the vortex?" stammered Gargavar. "You saw me, kid." "And it was working?" "Sure was." "And you saw the whole infinity of creation?" "Sure, really neat place. You know what? You know that?" Gargavar's mind was reeling in astonishment. Had his body been with him, it would have sat down heavily with its mouth hanging open. "And you saw yourself," said Gargavar, "in relation to it all." "Oh, yeah. But what did you experience?" Zaphod shrugged smugly. "It just told me what I knew all the time. I'm a really terrific and great guy. Didn't I tell you, baby? I'm Zaphod Beeblebrox." His gaze passed over the machinery which powered the vortex and suddenly stopped, startled. He breathed heavily. "Hey," he said, "is that really a piece of fairy cake?" He ripped the small piece of confectionery from the censers, with which it was surrounded. "If I told you how much I needed this," he said ravenously, "I wouldn't have time to eat it." He ate it. Chapter 12. A short while later, he was running across the plain in the direction of the ruined city. The dank air wheezed heavily in his lungs, and he frequently stumbled, with the exhaustion he was still feeling. Night was beginning to fall, too, and the rough ground was treacherous. The elation of his recent experience was still with him, though. The whole universe. He had seen the whole universe stretching to infinity around him, everything, and with it had come the clear and extraordinary knowledge that he was the most important thing in it. Having a conceited ego is one thing, actually being told by a machine is another. He didn't have time to reflect on this matter. Gargavar had told him that he would have to alert his masters as to what had happened, but that he was prepared to leave a decent interval before doing so, enough time for Zaphod to make a break and find somewhere to hide. What he was going to do, he didn't know, but feeling that he was the most important person in the universe gave him the confidence to believe that something would turn up. Nothing else on this blighted planet could give him much grounds for optimism. He ran on and soon reached the outskirts of the abandoned city. He walked along cracked and gaping roads riddled with scrawny weeds, the holes filled with rotting shoes. The buildings he passed were so crumbled and decrepit he thought it unsafe to enter any of them. Where could he hide? He hurried on. After a while, the remains of a wide sweeping road led off from the one down which he was walking, and at its end lay a vast low building, surrounded by sundry smaller ones, the whole surrounded by the remains of a perimeter barrier. The large main building still seemed reasonably solid, and Zaphod turned to see if it might provide him with anything. He approached the building. Along one side of it, the front, it would seem, since it faced a wide concreted apron area, were three gigantic doors, maybe 6 feet high. The far one of these was open, and toward this Zaphod ran. Inside, all was gloom, dust, and confusion. Giant cobwebs lay over everything. Part of the infrastructure of the building had collapsed. Part of the rear wall had caved in, and a thick, choking dust lay inches over the floor. Through the heavy gloom, huge shapes loomed, covered with debris. The shapes were sometimes cylindrical, sometimes bulbous, sometimes like eggs, or rather cracked eggs. Most of them were split open or falling apart. Some were mere skeletons. They were all spacecraft, all derelict. Zaphod wandered in frustration among the hulks. There was nothing here that remotely approached the serviceable. Even the mere vibration of his footsteps caused one precarious wreck to collapse further into itself. Toward the rear of the building lay one old ship, slightly larger than the others, and buried beneath even deeper piles of dust and cobwebs. Its outline, however, seemed unbroken. Zaphod approached it with interest, and as he did so, he tripped over an old feed line. He tried to toss the feed line aside, and to his surprise discovered that it was still connected to the ship. To his utter astonishment, he realized that the feed line was also humming slightly. He stared at the ship in disbelief, and then back down at the feed line in his hands. He tore off his jacket and threw it aside. Crawling along on his hands and knees, he followed the feed line to the point where it connected with the ship. The connection was sound, and the slight humming vibration was more distinct. His heart was beating fast. He wiped away some grime and laid an ear against the ship's side. He could hear only a faint, indeterminate noise. He rummaged feverishly among the debris lying on the floor all about him, and found a short length of tubing and a non-biodegradable plastic cup. Out of this, he fashioned a crude stethoscope and placed it against the side of the ship. What he heard made his brains turn somersaults. The voice said, "Transstellar Cruise Lines would like to apologize to passengers for the continued delay to this flight. We are currently awaiting the loading of our complement of small lemon-soaked paper napkins for your comfort, refreshment, and hygiene during the journey. Meanwhile, we thank you for your patience. The cabin crew will shortly be serving coffee and biscuits again." Zaphod staggered backwards, staring wildly at the ship. He walked around for a few minutes in a daze. In doing so, he suddenly caught sight of a giant departure board still hanging, but by only one support from the ceiling above him. It was covered with grime, but some of the figures were still discernible. Zaphod's eyes searched among the figures, then made some brief calculations. His eyes widened. 900 years? He breathed to himself. This was how late the ship was? 2 minutes later, he was on board. As he stepped out of the airlock, the air that greeted him was cool and fresh. The air conditioning was still working. The lights were still on. He moved out of the small entrance chamber into a short, narrow corridor and stepped nervously down it. Suddenly, a door opened and a figure stepped out in front of him. "Please return to your seat, sir," said the android stewardess, and turning her back on him, she walked on down the corridor in front of him. When his heart had started beating again, he followed her. She opened the door at the end of the corridor and walked through. He followed her through the door. They were now in a passenger compartment, and Zaphod's heart stopped still again for a moment. In every seat sat a passenger strapped into his or her seat. The passenger's hair was long and unkempt. Their fingernails were long. The men wore beards. All of them were quite clearly alive, but sleeping. Zaphod had the creeping horrors. He walked slowly down the aisle as in a dream. By the time he was halfway down the aisle, the stewardess had reached the other end. She turned and spoke. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," she said sweetly. "Thank you for bearing with us during this slight delay. We will be taking off as soon as we possibly can. If you would like to wake up now, I will serve you coffee and biscuits." There was a slight hum. At that moment, all the passengers awoke. They awoke screaming and clawing at the straps and life support systems that held them tightly in their seats. They screamed and bawled and hollered till Zaphod thought his ears would shatter. They struggled and writhed as the stewardess patiently moved up the aisle, placing a small cup of coffee and a packet of biscuits in front of each one of them. Then one of them rose from his seat. He turned and looked at Zaphod. Zaphod's skin was crawling all over his body as if it was trying to get off. He turned and ran from the bedlam. He plunged through the door and back into the corridor. The man pursued him. He raced in a frenzy to the end of the corridor, through the entrance chamber and beyond. He arrived on the flight deck, slammed and bolted the door behind him. He leaned back against the door, breathing hard. Within seconds, a hand started beating on the door. From somewhere on the flight deck, a metallic voice addressed him. Passengers are not allowed on the flight deck. Please return to your seat and wait for the ship to take off. Coffee and biscuits are being served. This is your autopilot speaking. Please return to your seat. Zaphod said nothing. He breathed hard. Behind him, the hand continued to knock on the door. Please return to your seat, repeated the autopilot. Passengers are not allowed on the flight deck. I'm not a passenger, panted Zaphod. Please return to your seat. I am not a passenger, shouted Zaphod again. Please return to your seat. I am not. Hello, can you hear me? Please return to your seat. You're the autopilot? Said Zaphod. Yes, said the voice from the flight console. You're in charge of this ship. Yes, said the voice again. There has been a delay. Passengers are to be kept temporarily in suspended animation for their comfort and convenience. Coffee and biscuits are served every year, after which passengers are returned to suspended animation for their continued comfort and convenience. Departure will take place when the flight stores are complete. We apologize for the delay. Zaphod moved away from the door on which the pounding now ceased. He approached the flight console. Delay, he cried. Have you seen the world outside the ship? It's a wasteland, a desert. Civilization's been and gone, man. There are no lemon-soaked paper napkins on the way from anywhere. The statistical likelihood, continued the autopilot primly, is that other civilizations will arise. There will one day be lemon-soaked paper napkins. Till then, there will be a short delay. Please return to your seat. But at that moment, the door opened. Zaphod spun around to see the man who had pursued him standing there. He carried a large briefcase. He was smartly dressed, and his hair was short. He had no beard and no long fingernails. Zaphod Beeblebrox, he said. My name is Zarniwoop. I believe you wanted to see me? Zaphod Beeblebrox withered. His mouth said foolish things. He dropped into a chair. Oh man, where did you spring from? He said. I have been waiting here for you, he said in a businesslike tone. He put the briefcase down and sat in another chair. I am glad you followed instructions, he said. I was a bit nervous that you might have left my office by door rather than the window. Then you would have been in trouble. Zaphod shook his head at him and burbled. When you entered the door of my office, you entered my electronically synthesized universe, he explained. If you had left by the door, you would have been back in the real one. The artificial one works from here. He patted his briefcase smugly. Zaphod glared at him with resentment and loathing. What's the difference? He muttered. Nothing, said Zarniwoop. They are identical. Oh, except that I think the frog starfighters are gray in the real universe. What's going on? Spat Zaphod. Simple, said Zarniwoop. His self-assurance and smugness made Zaphod seethe. Very simple, repeated Zarniwoop. I discovered the coordinates at which this man could be found, the man who rules the universe, and discovered that his world was protected by an unprobability field. To protect my secret and myself, I retreated to the safety of this totally artificial universe and hid myself away in a forgotten cruise liner. I was secure. Meanwhile, you and I... You and I? Said Zaphod angrily. You mean I knew you? Yes, said Zarniwoop. We knew each other well. I had no taste, said Zaphod, and resumed a sullen silence. Meanwhile, you and I arranged that you would steal the improbability drive ship, the only one which could reach the ruler's world, and bring it to me here. This you have now done, I trust, and I congratulate you. He smiled, a tight little smile which Zaphod wanted to hit with a brick. Oh, in case you were wondering, said Zarniwoop, this universe was created specifically for you to come to. You are, therefore, the most important person in this universe. You would never, he said, with an even more brickable smile, have survived the total perspective vortex in the real one. Shall we go? Where? Said Zaphod sullenly. He felt collapsed. To your ship, the Heart of Gold. You did bring it, I trust. No. Where's your jacket? Zaphod looked at him in mystification. My jacket? I took it off. It's outside. Good, we will go and find it. Zarniwoop stood up and gestured to Zaphod to follow him. Out in the entrance chamber again, they could hear the screams of the passengers being fed coffee and biscuits. It has not been a pleasant experience waiting for you, said Zarniwoop. Not pleasant for you, bawled Zaphod. How do you think? Zarniwoop held up a silencing finger as the hatchway swung open. A few feet away from them, they could see Zaphod's jacket lying in the debris. A very remarkable and very powerful ship, said Zarniwoop. Watch. As they watched, the pocket on the jacket suddenly bulged. It split. It ripped. The small metal model of the heart of gold that Zaphod had been bewildered to discover in his pocket was growing. It grew, it continued to grow. It reached, after 2 minutes, its full size. An improbability level, said Zarniwoop, of, oh, I don't know, but something very large. Zaphod swayed. You mean I had it with me all the time? Zarniwoop smiled. He lifted up his briefcase and opened it. He twisted a single switch inside. Goodbye, artificial universe, he said. Hello, real one. The scene before them shimmered briefly and reappeared exactly as before. You see, said Zarniwoop, exactly the same. You mean, repeated Zaphod tautly, that I had it with me all the time? Oh, yes, said Zarniwoop, of course. That was the whole point. That's it, said Zaphod. You can count me out from here on in. You can count me out. I've had all of this I want. You play your own games. I'm afraid you cannot leave, said Zarniwoop. You are entwined in the improbability field. You cannot escape. He smiled a smile that Zaphod had wanted to hit, and this time Zaphod hit it. Okay. Chapter 13. Ford Prefect bounded up to the bridge of the Heart of Gold. Trillian, Arthur, he shouted. It's working. The ship's reactivated. Trillian and Arthur were asleep on the floor. Come on, you guys. We're going. We're off, he said, kicking them awake. Hi there, guys, twittered the computer. It's really great to be back with you again. I can tell you, I just want to say that... Shut up, said Ford. Tell us where the hell we are. Frogstar World B. And man, it's a dump, said Zaphod, running into the bridge. Hi, guys. You must be so amazingly glad to see me. You can't even find words to tell me what a cool fruit I am. What a what? Said Arthur blearily, picking himself up from the floor and not taking any of this in. I know how you feel, said Zaphod. I'm so great, even I get tongue-tied talking to myself. Hey, it's good to see you, Trillian, Ford, Monkey Man. Hey, computer. Hi there, Mr. Beeblebrox, sir. Sure is a great honor to... Shut up and get us out of here. Fast, fast, fast. Sure thing, fella. Where do you want to go? Anywhere. Doesn't matter, shouted Zaphod. Yes, it does, he said again. We want to go to the nearest place to eat. Sure thing, said the computer happily, and a massive explosion rocked the bridge. When Zarniwoop entered a minute or so later with a black eye, he regarded the 4 wisps of smoke with interest. Price